right, so how many of you went out this week and purchased something? All right, how many of you actually needed that thing that you purchased? Okay. Again, when we think about needs, sometimes that's where it gets really interesting, right? Because we really like to justify a lot of the things that we buy. Now, how many of us took a couple of seconds to include God into your thinking and decision-making process as you did that? Okay. All right. So, obviously, you know, as Americans, we have a lot of stuff. In fact, I just watched a short documentary called The Story of Stuff, and you can find it on YouTube, or you can find the same clip on a website called thestoryofstuff.org. And it's really kind of an interesting and eye-opening experience. And so the author of that, Annie Leonard, she goes on and she talks about how as Americans, we represent 5% of the world's total population, and yet we consume 30% of the world's resources. All right? And so again, she goes on to say, you know what, if everyone consumed as much as we did in America, essentially we would need 3 to 5 planets to hold and produce all the stuff. Now, obviously, I think many of you that are older realize that we consume more stuff today than we did 50 years ago. In fact, the statistics say it's almost about twice as much now as it was back in the 1950s. And we've largely become a nation with a consumer identity, one where our value is determined by how much money we make and how much stuff we have. So I've got another question for you. How much of the stuff that we buy do you think is actually in use 6 to 8 months later? Yeah, we're hearing some chuckles because we realize that not very much of it. Now again, she says that in her story that it's roughly only 1% of all the stuff we buy is in use 6 months later. All right? So that means either we've gone through and we've moved it through our house and thrown it out, or we've stuffed it in our house somewhere just to let it sit there because we don't want to get rid of it. All right? Now, you know, Sarah and I moved into our house in Jim Falls about 8 or 9 years before we moved up here. And I cannot tell you how much crap we had to get out of that house so we could move up here. It just amazes me. All right? Like, I'm pretty sure I'm working on my 2nd ton of books. Literally, my 2nd ton of books. All right? For some of you, maybe it's closets full of clothes and shoes. For others of you, maybe it's tools and car parts. Or maybe you just like to collect a whole bunch of different stuff. I don't know. Now, before we begin today, I think all of us, at least many of us who are Christians, understand that stuff is not inherently bad. Okay? We need money to go about and purchase the things that we need. We can even have a little bit of fun with the money. There are certain things that we need in our lives, but the heart of the matter is, where are our heart's intentions? What is the thing that we're focused on? Where do we find our true identity? Is it found in the stuff, or is it found in God? So I want to go through and I want to talk a little bit to you about some of the problems that we have when it comes with stuff, because so many of us have been conditioned to think that we need lots and lots of stuff. In fact, there's a guy named Victor Lebow. He was an economist back in the 1950s, and he had this to say about how we should consume products. He said, our enormously productive enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfactions, our ego satisfactions in consumption. The measure of social status, of social acceptance, of prestige is now to be found in our consumptive patterns. The very meaning and significance of our lives today expressed in consumptive terms. The greater the pressure upon the individual to conform to safe and accepted social standards, the more does he tend to express his aspirations and his individuality in terms of what he wears, drives, eats, his home, his car, his pattern of food serving, and his hobbies. Ouch. Right? I mean, that's pretty tough to swallow. It's not like we just that this just happened to come about, but this was determined. The lifestyle that we learn and we live in was determined by people. And so again, it's quite concerning when we learn that the things that we view on TV, the ads, the messages that we constantly receive tell us that our experience, our happiness, even our spiritual satisfaction is to be determined by the things that we have, the things that we do. Now again, in her documentary, Annie will go on and talk about the system of consumerism that has developed here in the West. And again, it's really some eye-opening information. But one of the things that fuels this are a couple of terms that we have trouble, I think, understanding. What they're called planned and perceived obsolescence. All right? Now, planned obsolescence is the calculated act of making sure an existing version of a product will become dated or useless within a given time frame. So essentially what happens is that the people that are producing products for us purposely design them to break or to go out of date so that we have to purchase a new one. Again, how many of you that are older had a refrigerator or a washing machine or dryer that's lasted 30 to 50 years? All right? Now, how many of you have bought that same thing and it barely lasts 10 without stuff going on with it? All right? You know, just this last month, I finally got tired of having to wait so long for my coffee in the morning, waiting for my French press to get done, that I just went out and bought an auto-drip coffee maker because my last one broke. And I got it home and I took it out of the box and I was just disgusted by the quality of it. I mean, it literally feels like I'm going to push the tray in and it's going to break. All right? And yet I spent a fair amount of money on it because of the name and because of how fast that it works. And yet, quite literally, it's a piece of junk designed to break so that I can go out and buy another one. Now, we also have this thing called perceived obsolescence. And this is, again, where some of our conditioning happens. It's when a person is persuaded into replacing a product before the old one has lost its functionality. All right? This is obviously most common in things like clothing. You know what? You've got to have that new pair of shoes or that new pair of jeans because the one from 10 years ago, man, you just look outdated. Or maybe it's your furniture. You know, maybe you still got the furniture from the 70s and heck, it still works, it's still comfortable, there's still cushioning, but would you be caught dead showing that pattern to someone today? And so again, guys, some of this stuff just, we don't even know how subtle it is and how much it affects our lives and how much we give in to some of this stuff. And the danger here is that, again, not that stuff is bad. All right? Yes, I think we have some work to do on going back and requiring corporations and people that make goods to do a good job, to make sure they're not just harming the environment on one end and the other, but to go back and produce some good stuff. But again, we have to be very careful that we're not making a fundamental shift in our heart. And that fundamental shift in transposing some of our priorities. And so, folks, this week we're going to continue looking at our Exodus series. And I want to say this to you. If we're to experience true freedom, we must decide if we're going to put our trust and faith in goods or in God. Because both of them have consequences for our lives. So let's go in and let's look at the story of the Israelites, because in many ways they're dealing with the same issue. They're having to look at their heart and their relationship with God and say, look, what do I value more, and what are the consequences of that? So we are in chapter 16 today. If you have a Bible or you're online, I invite you to follow along, because we're going to move through the chapter relatively quickly, and I've been fairly selective in what we're going to look at today. But again, if you remember last week, the Israelites just got brought out of Egypt. They just were able to walk through the sea and have that miraculous experience. And now, guess what? They don't find themselves in paradise, but they find themselves in a desert. Okay? And so after everything that's just happened, they find themselves in a place that they don't really like, and they begin to grumble. How many of us ever grumble about our circumstances and our situations? All right? It doesn't matter sometimes how good life just was just a few days ago. Man, when that bad thing happens, we just start shaking our head and we start complaining, don't we? So I think we can identify a lot with the Israelites here. Okay? And so they basically come to Moses and Aaron and they start crying and saying, you know what? At least when we were in Egypt, we used to sit around and have these big pots of food and of meat, and we could eat all of the food we wanted. But you brought us out here into the middle of nowhere to starve this entire assembly to death. Now, again, I'm not going to doubt that when you've got 1 to 2 million people out in the desert, that food really is an issue. All right? And yet again, what has just happened? They've just witnessed a ton of miraculous, supernatural things, and now they're getting hit with just some of their fundamental needs, just the simple need for food, trying to figure out how they're going to survive in this desert. And so, again, God takes them out of physical slavery, but now he begins to work on their heart. And he goes down, and we're going to see that in many ways, the people complaining about food shows a crisis in their belief about provision, but it's also going to lead to a crisis in their faith. So let's watch and see what happens. So in verses 4 and 5 then, God basically hears their grumbling, and he comes to Moses and says, you know what, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that it is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. All right? So there's a lot of stuff in here. So let's begin to break this down. And again, think about how God might be calling the people, the Israelites, to respond. Now, again, for the people who have just experienced them, this idea of God raining down, and later in the later verse we'll see that he's going to have quail come and cover the earth. The people just saw 2 plagues in Egypt that did that very same thing. It's the 7th and 8th plagues that hit Egypt. The 7th plague is that hail will come down and destroy all of the food. The 2nd, or the 8th plague, is that locusts will come and cover the earth. And so here, God is saying, you know what? I did this supernatural thing, but this is the order that I've created, and I am now going to rain down bread from heaven. And later in this chapter, he says, I will cover the earth with this quail. All right? So again, it ties back to the work that God has already done and the order that God has established. All right? Secondly, we find that despite the people's grumbles, God doesn't take them out of the desert. All right? God says, you know what? You're here. I'm going to provide for you here. Now, how many of us, when things get rough, immediately begin to pray and seek God's will that we get removed from that situation? I think a lot of us do. God, help me. I don't feel good. I want to just feel better. Or God, I'm struggling in my job and I just want to get out. And yet oftentimes I think if we would open our vision, open our perspectives up, we would see that God is answering our prayers in the midst of those sometimes very difficult circumstances in situations that we find ourselves in. Now, again, I highlighted in verse 4 this idea that the people are to go out each day and to gather enough for that day. And there's two real principles here that I think are important. One, this is very reminiscent of our Lord's Prayer, isn't it? Give us this day our daily bread. I mean, think about that prayer, that we're to go out each day and ask God to give us what we need. And I truly believe that God gives us the things that we need. All right? The second part is that we have to go out. That again, yes, God will provide this. God will rain down the bread from heaven. Yes, the quail will come and cover the earth. But it still requires some work on our part. We're to go out and gather the things that we need. In today's age, we would say, I have to go to my job so that I can get the money I need to care for my family, to run my household. All right? You know, so often we think, when we begin to think about God's provision for us, I feel like we often go to these extremes where one, we hear the promise, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven, and it's just like we're going to sit at our kitchen table and it's just going to plop right down on our plate and we're not going to have to do anything. Right? I mean, that would be really nice. Can God do that? Absolutely, God can. But that's not the experience that we have most of the time. Again, God encourages us to work together, to work symbiotically with each other. All right? Now, the other part that I want to draw us to is this point about God testing them, and in some ways testing us with the stuff that we have. All right? Why would God test them here? I mean, He's bringing His people, His oppressed people. He's made all of these promises for them. He's done all of these things. Why does He immediately begin to test them? Well, part of it is because it's going to be reflective of their heart. And is their heart going to be focused on Him? Are they truly going to live into the relationship that God has set for them? Or are they going to try to do things their own way? All right? Now, again, some of us go a little bit further, and we don't really like the idea of God testing us, but sometimes I think we really like to test God. And I want to share a little story with you, and this story comes from the late, great Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias. And he tells this story of this little boy who really desired a bicycle, but he wasn't sure how to get this bicycle. So after consulting with his mother, she says, well, son, why don't you just go pray for this bicycle? Well, the boy realized that he didn't really know how to pray, so he goes to the internet and he finds this high church program on the internet, and he watches it, and he discovers he really likes this prayer, so he writes it down, and he goes to his bedroom, kneels beside his bed, and he prays, Almighty and eternal God, if it is in your sovereign will that I have a bicycle, I would be entirely grateful if you would provide it to me. World without end. Amen. He goes to bed, he wakes up the next day, runs downstairs, there's no bicycle there. He's a little frustrated, so he goes back to the internet, he finds a different program, he learns another prayer, and he goes back into his bedroom, he kneels down beside his bed, and he prays, Dear Jesus, I declare my need for a bicycle, and I state that it should be silver and blue. And I declare it should be here by tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Amen. So immediately the kid goes to bed. He wakes up right away at 6 o'clock in the morning, run downstairs, still no bicycle. So now the child is distraught. And his mother sees him wandering around the house that day, and eventually he goes over to the table and he grabs a small statue of the Virgin Mary, he tucks it under his arm, and he runs outside into the woods. A few minutes later he comes back in and the statue's gone. And so his mother kind of follows him upstairs, and she finds him kneeling at his bed, and he says, "Dear Jesus, if you ever want to see your mother again..." Okay. So don't some of us kind of like to do that? Don't we kind of like to use God as a vending machine some of the time in our prayers? Again, I find that one pretty humorous. But again, it speaks to our heart. And again, do I believe that we should pray to God if there are things that we need? Yes, I do. But we also have to pray that it's God's will be done, not my will be done. And is the thing that I'm asking for in alignment with God's will and His purpose for my life? So now, in our story, God delivers. And it says that evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. And so there was their bread, which they called manna. And so, folks, again, whether it is supernatural provision like this, or whether, again, you just have a job that takes care of you, that God is working through you in, I believe that when we are in an intentional and in right relationship, God blesses those activities that we do, and that God does provide the needs that we have. Again, they don't always look like we think they should sometimes, but God does provide. Now, maybe some of you are asking the question, well, Josh, if God provides, why are there so many people in poverty? What about people that actually don't have some of their needs? And that's a tough question to wrestle with. But again, what is our response as a people? Where's our heart? Because how many of us, in some way, could fill that need for other people? Whether it's going to places and empowering people to do certain things, to provide for themselves, whether it's being charitable and donating time, energy, and resources to do that. There's an answer to that problem, and it's a complex one. But again, how would God lead us to solve even that question? Everyone's need gets met here, as we find in verses 16 through 18. And so again, the Lord commands that everyone goes out and they gather what they need. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. And when they measured it, the one who gathered much did not gather too much, and the one that gathered too little did not gather the one that gathered little did not gather too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. All right? And folks, there's a beauty in that. That when we work in alignment with God, we have the things that we need, and so does everyone else. And so, again, this comes back to being a question of stewardship versus ownership. Am I going to take all of this stuff for myself, or can I take just what I need so that there are things for other people? That there's stuff to go around. Now think about this even in terms of our tithing and our giving and our charity. I can't speak for any of you, but I can say that in Sarah and I's life, the more intentionally and God-led that we have tithed in our life, the greater blessing that we have seen. There's a direct correlation to that. All right? Because there's been some times that, we didn't have double income all of the time. There was times that we worked on a little bit, and yet we consistently tithed from a good heart intention that this was what we were going to do to serve God, and it just was amazing to see God's provision in that. Now the world likes to twist that around and say, oh, you have to give to get. And in some cases that's true, but if our intention in giving is just to get stuff back, then we're doing it for the absolute wrong reason. We give because that's where God leads us to do, because that's God's will and not our will. So everything seems to be going okay, and then all of a sudden, some problems arise. So Moses goes out and orders the people, you know what? This is a gift. This is a daily gift that you're to have, and you're not to keep any of it left over for tomorrow morning. But pretty soon, people try to save a little bit left for tomorrow. And again, it seems completely reasonable that a people going through the desert that don't know how they're going to survive, they don't know where food is going to come from, that yeah, maybe they might try to do things on their own and say, you know what, I'm not really sure if God's going to provide more bread and quail tomorrow, so I'll just keep this little extra on the side. But again, God works and it exposes their heart. And they wake up in the morning and the food that they have now is rotten. It's spoiled and has maggots in it. Because again, folks, where is the trust? Where is the faith? And our faith is not just something we do at grand moments in our life. It's a day-by-day walk. It's a day-by-day journey with God. And when we allow things like fear and greed to enter in, because we're scared that there might not be enough, or maybe if we save it up, we can stockpile a whole bunch of stuff, we run into a problem because that's not how God designed things to work. All right? Again, give us this day our daily bread. Now, Danielle Strickland would say that fear and greed makes us oppressed by a desire for more and oppressors in our refusal to share. And if we think about that, I think that that's a very true statement. Okay? And again, I've seen people on both ends of the poverty spectrum, if you will. And again, this is a tangent, but poverty is more than just money. Okay? It's a much bigger picture than that. But I have seen people who have absolutely nothing be the greediest people that you will ever meet. I've seen rich people be some of the greediest people you will ever meet. I've seen some people who live in poverty who give everything they have and are some of the most generous people you will ever meet. And I've seen some people who seem to have everything who are very generous in their charity and giving to others. So again, where is our heart? Because again, if our heart isn't aligned with God's will, guess what? When it comes to stuff especially, we're going to find that our will makes us either hoard stuff or take stuff from other people because we think we have a right to it. So nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. And so again, if you go back to the beginning of the scripture we looked at, we remember that God told the people to make provision for the Sabbath, for the seventh day, that there would be no bread, and yet some people go out looking for more. Again, is it just because they procrastinated? Is it because they didn't actually do what they were supposed to and gather the resources they needed? Or is it, again, them thinking, you know what, well, guess what, I might be able to go out and create a little bit of a stockpile here on this day because no one else is going to go out and get it. Where do we do that? How often do we hold and cling to things that aren't really of any value, but we just think we need to hold on to them? We need to stockpile them. I mean, look at some of the TV shows we have, like like hoarders, and you see how it becomes a mental illness where people just simply can't figure out how to get rid of stuff. Right? And pretty soon it affects their entire lives, both mentally and physically, because they're so scared to give up some of that stuff. On the other end of stuff, how many of us begin to use stuff almost as a form of medication? Where we say, you know what, I need some new stuff to make me feel better. And so I go out to the store and I buy that new pair of shoes, or for me, I buy that cup of coffee or that book. Maybe Eric goes out and buys another toolbox and some tools. Whatever it is, we can begin to medicate with our stuff, and pretty soon that becomes a process over and over. I need more stuff so I feel better. Well, guess what? Now I got to go work more so that I can pay for that stuff. And now I don't feel, now I'm not happy about that, so I got to go buy some more stuff. And pretty soon we find ourselves like a hamster on a wheel. All right? And this is exactly what the consumer mindset that we have in this country does. And folks, again, I think many of us understand this, but things do not provide us happiness. In fact, more and more studies are going out to find that for Americans, the more stuff we have, there's no correlation between that and our happiness. At a certain point, most social scientists think somewhere in the middle class, you have enough stuff to just be comfortable and you have the greatest amount of happiness there, so anything above and beyond that doesn't make you any happier. It just makes you more stressed out, perhaps, because again, you move into that process, that cycle of working and buying and working and buying and working and buying, and pretty soon you have to ask the question, am I living to work or am I working to live? And again, where is your heart? What things is God calling you to do that you're not able to do because you're so busy working trying to get more stuff? And it causes a strain on our relationships. And I don't believe God asks us to do some of this stuff just simply for obedience sake. All right? He's not asking us to follow rules just to follow rules. But he has them put in there because, again, he is a God who loves us. He's a good God who desires a relationship with us, and he wants to provide for us. And he puts these things in place so that we can flourish, so that we can live in abundance. And when we don't listen, it strains that relationship, and we continue to chase after something that just is not fulfilling. And so, folks, which will you choose today? Will you choose a life that leads to freedom and flourishing? Or will you continue to chase after stuff and choose a life that can lead to bondage and to misery? So my action step for you today is to be intentional and God-aligned in your consuming this week. I want you to invite God into your purchasing and consuming decisions this week. Again, ask the questions. Is this a need or is it a want? Is it aligned with God's will for my life, or is it just something I want to do to make myself feel better? Now again, this can seem like a real heavy thing, and I don't think God intends for us. It's not God's will for him to micromanage us, where we're asking God every single time, oh, God, can I buy this pencil because I really need it so that I can write my sermon, and if I don't have it, just please give me your... Okay, I don't think that we have to get to that level. But what does it look like when we're at least intentional and conscientious about those decisions? Because again, maybe I already have a drawer full of pencils or a really good computer that I can write my sermon on, and I don't need to go out and make that purchase. And I might be able to use that money for some other form of ministry or some other part of the calling which God has. So be prayerful about that, and I hope that you find that inviting and welcoming this week. God bless.